the memo. You're here on time. I didn't see anybody frantically trying to get into church an hour early or come knocking on my door say what happened. But I think I ought to warn you here. On social media, there's all kinds of cute little cartoons and sketches here about the time change here and turning back your clocks. But there was one really interesting one that I thought so appropriate. A reminder, you probably don't get this one, but it hit me. It said, pastors, remember changing the clocks. You get an extra hour to preach. So buckle up. Here we go. All right. So today I titled the message, If the Lord is God, and keying on a particular verse, actually part of verse 21, because we are going to key on that verse. But I could just as well have entitled this message, Showdown. Because as I read through this story, it brings to mind all kinds of images that boil down to a showdown. I read this passage and immediately pops into my mind the classic Disney cartoon, I think it's Disney, The Sword and the Stone. It's the comic children's version here of King Arthur and how he becomes King of England. How many of you remember playing that or watching that with kids or grandkids? The comic version of Arthur growing up, and it shows how he is being trained up and raised up to get ready, how Merlin is training him and getting him ready. And in there is a classic scene here. There's a wizard's duel between Merlin and Madame Mim. So I see Elijah here and these prophets of Baal and Asherah, and I'm thinking, oh man, we got some kind of duel going on. Maybe that's not your style, maybe that's not your jam, but you might think about some kind of shootout, a western, an OK Corral or something like this. Two people head to head at high noon. We're gonna duke it out. There's so many versions of the big fight to settle whatever the issue is that needs to be settled. Here today, we have a showdown that's a little bit unusual, grant you. We have a showdown between Elijah and King Ahab for the people of Israel. But Ahab doesn't fight for himself, does he? Ahab is the king. Ahab doesn't fight for himself. So on paper, it is Elijah versus 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Talk about long odds. In reality, this is a showdown for the people of Israel between God and the so-called gods Baal and Asherah. Let's pause here and let's read and go through this story here and think about it a little bit. Today we are in 1 Kings chapter 18. Your bulletin says verse 17. Just hold that screen there a second, Don. I'm going to back up to verse 16 so that we're not like in the middle of a sentence here. So beginning at verse 16, Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I've not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves. Let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping, must be waking." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice, but there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. And all the people saw this. They fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord is God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, it's a little bit of an understatement to say there's a lot going on there, isn't it? There is a lot going on. And even more in what follows. What follows right away at Elijah's bidding. The people seized all 950 of those prophets of Baal and Asherah and put them to death. It is one of the more grisly scenes in the Bible. That might evoke images of what is unfolding in the Middle East right now for some, with all that brings up, questions, uncertainties, objections, on and on. All of that from one little verse, verse 40, the next verse. But that's a whole other sermon or conversation for another day. Before we get there, we have plenty to wrestle with in our passage that we have today. And maybe if we can get some clarity on the story that you just heard, on the story that we just read, maybe if we can get some clarity with that, it might help us to understand what did come after, even if it still leaves you a bit uncomfortable. So digging into our story that we have today, the showdown. What do we see? What do we see in this story? Well, first of all, let's make sure that we are clear on the setting. Let's make sure that we are clear about what is going on here. Here we are in the time that the kingdom is divided. Last week, we heard about how it got divided. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, couldn't hold the kingdom together after it was passed on from his father Solomon. He couldn't hold it together due to his own desire to be looked on as powerful, probably in part due to some insecurity that he had about himself. Can you imagine trying to follow in the footsteps of Solomon, the person who is understood to have been the wisest one who ever lived? Imagine trying to follow in those footsteps. So Jeroboam becomes king of 10 tribes in the north. Rehoboam couldn't hold it together. Jeroboam becomes king of 10 tribes in the north, and Rehoboam, who should have had it all, only manages to hold on to 2 tribes in the south. Today we are in Israel. We are in the northern part of the kingdom. We are in the larger part that is split off from what had been David and Solomon's kingdom. Now, from the start, if we go back to last week, from the start, the people, especially the people in the north, viewed Jeroboam as a better alternative to Rehoboam to be king. They thought that Jeroboam was going to be better than Rehoboam. But it didn't take long to see that Jeroboam, this new king, God appointed this new king, he had plenty of issues himself. There was a lot going on there that wasn't right as well. And so what happens in the north, in this giant splinter that split off in the north, we find a succession of kings beginning with Jeroboam, continuing on. That it's a succession of kings that the next one comes and is worse than the one before, and the next one comes and is worse than the one before. Over and over, they're just worse and worse and worse and worse, up until we get to King Ahab. I know today we are in 1 Kings 18, but if you read ahead in 1 Kings chapter 21 at verse 25, you're still in the story of Ahab, but it tells us there in 1 Kings 21:25, part of Ahab's story declares, there never was anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. In other words, this king that we have here today, King Ahab, he was the worst of the worst. Completely over the top. Ahab has been ruling Israel, leading them further and further astray than they already were, reinforcing all that was wrong in the eyes of the Lord. So God, as we get into the story today, has been punishing Israel. Israel is in a drought that has been going on for 3 years. You need to understand that. Israel is in a drought that has been going on for 3 years because of their unfaithfulness, because of their king. They are a mess beyond words. Meanwhile, God has raised up the prophet Elijah to speak God's word to Ahab and to all the people. So understanding that, let's get back to the story. Sensational as it is, the story is simple enough. It boils down to this. It boils down to a choice. People, you've got a choice to make. That's what it's all about. It reminds us, if we will be reminded a little bit further back in Israel's history, in Joshua chapter 24, when Joshua, who was leading the Israelites newly into the promised land, is about to die. He knows his time is about up. He gets before the people and he is confronting them and challenging them and charging them. And he says, you need to choose this day who you will serve. Are you going to serve those other gods? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now back then with Joshua, the people heard that challenge. They heard that charge and they said, oh yeah, we're going to follow God. Yes. But here we are today, at the time of Ahab. It is generations later. It is hundreds of years later. People have forgotten. They have forgotten God, or they just disregard God. They're not paying attention. So there's a similar question from Elijah to begin this whole thing here. Will it be God? Will it be the Lord? Or Baal? Or Asherah? Or something else? Verse 21 says, if the Lord is God, follow him. Now here the word Lord, if you have your Bible open, it probably has that written down, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. In our English translations, when you see that, that is how the English translates and how it makes stand out and distinguish that the Hebrew word there was the name, the special name that God gave to Moses to identify who he is. That is, Lord is standing in for the name, the personal, intimate name of Yahweh. If the Lord, if Yahweh is God, follow him. This is the special name by which they knew their God. This is the name that God used when he called Moses to take his people, to rescue his people out of Egypt. Elijah is asking, will you follow God? Do you see the Lord Yahweh is really the God? Or you prefer another? Because there were options. Israel's promised land that they are living in, the land they came back to from Egypt, had living in it when they came other people, primarily Canaanites. Those Canaanites had their own gods that they worshipped. A whole bunch of gods, I said S on purpose, a whole bunch of gods, but the greatest of their gods, the leader of their gods, was a god named Baal. Baal, they believed, was god of storms and rain and fertility. Alongside Baal was Asherah, goddess of fertility. By the time of Ahab, many Israelites, God's people, were worshiping Baal and Asherah either alongside of God or instead of God, the God of Israel. Note the irony of this. Ahab and Israel are worshiping other gods, gods of storms and rain and fertility, and still they are in a drought. Those other gods weren't helping much, were they? This is why Elijah calls everyone together. You can't go on this way. Something's got to give. Well, you shouldn't go on this way. Why would you want to? You're suffering. Why would they want to? Is it going to be God or Baal or Asherah? What follows? The altars, the sacrifice, the crazy dancing and crying out of all those 950 prophets of Baal and Asherah, compared to Elijah's simple prayer, were meant to show for all to see who really is God. Not just who is stronger, but who is real. It is an awesome scene to picture. If you can close your eyes and picture this scene, all of the people gathered around altars and all those prophets of Baal and Asherah dressed up and doing their thing and dancing around and cutting themselves, and just absolutely incredible. And then here comes Elijah taking the stones and rebuilding the altar, laying 12 stones together to represent the 12 tribes, even though right now they are a broken people, putting down 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, God's chosen people, the sacrifice on top, the wood arranged, and then he says, give me some jars. Fill them up. Pour it over top. What? What's he? We want this to burn. What? Do it again. Do it again. And then a simple prayer. A simple prayer. Fire! My sound effects, I have no idea what it sounds like. Fire that consumes. Fire that just obliterates. The sacrifice, the wood, the altar made of stone. How hot does it have to be to burn and to destroy stone? Even the soil around, everything is consumed. Doubts who is real? Any question? God, Baal, or Asherah? Any question at all? It is an amazing story. So many people read it as just a story, or it was a story way back then. Things are different now. That is a great story, but things are different now. Don't understand how it really is. I was reminded years ago, there was a couple that I got to know in one of the churches that we served. Got to be very good friends with them. They were a beautiful couple, loved each other deeply, were married over 50 years, I think, by the time that we were there. Wonderful, faithful servants. One night at church, actually in our weekly Bible study, the wife collapsed. We rushed to her aid and called 911. The ambulance came. She was rushed to the hospital. But she had had a massive heart event. Her heart had gone into AFib. It just beat so fast that the blood wouldn't move in her veins, and her brain was deprived of oxygen. And so till she got there to the hospital, just minutes away, she was brain dead. Her body was alive on machines, but her brain was gone. And there by her side stood her husband for weeks. He couldn't let go. Every little twitch that she might make, or every little tiny ripple that he perceived that maybe she made, he took it as a sign of hope. I think I saw her eyebrow. I think every little thing that he saw gave hope, because he was looking for hope. When everyone said, no, it isn't. I'm sorry, we're sorry. It just isn't there. He was looking so desperately. It was a sad, sad story till she passed away. I share this because I think that today so many are desperately looking for any sign of hope, any sign of life in all kinds of lifeless things. So many people are looking for signs of life in so many lifeless things. They blindly follow all kinds of paths or ideas, failing to see what is truth, failing to see what is real, what is there, namely God. There is nothing else but God. God gave ancient Israel a sign. Elijah's sacrifice. Guess what? Since then, God has given the world a sign that He is real. Jesus. And we must choose who we will follow. Now, it should be obvious. There is only one who can bring the rain and satisfy, who can refresh and renew. There is only one.